Now we will be discussing chapter 13. Since you have already discussed chapter 12 with me, which was about the inclusive growth. Now this chapter is further, more interesting for you, I believe, because in this chapter, what we have learned through using, inclusive growth criteria is we have tried to actually improve the measurement of inclusive growth, and then we are going to see that which era was more, more growth oriented in Pakistan. Was it dictatorship or the democracy era? And how far is the welfare state for Pakistan? Now, this is basically chapter 13 from the Book of Economic Management and Emerging Economic Issues by Professor Dr. Aslam, and I, Dr. Radiba, will be giving the lecture on this. This book is basically one of those books which not only that I have edited, but also have authored multiple chapters in this book. So let's begin. Now, before we begin into, the analysis and things that this chapter contains, let me give you a little bit of overview. Chapter 13 is one of the most intellectually proactive and politically sensitive topic, I believe, of this book. And since, you are doing a very important analysis, I must, say this as disclaimer that whatever I will be saying in this chapter is entirely based upon the research of the book Economic Management and Emerging Issues. And it is not something that is, based upon my analysis or based upon, any biases. So we have taken the data and we have analyzed it, and we have just made the scores. And based upon that data and that analysis, we have come up to these conclusions. So this is a little sensitive topic to discuss, but I believe that you must only look at this topic in the terms of economics, because as an economist, you will only discuss the economics, and that is what we are going to do in this chapter. Now, this chapter basically asks a question that has been debated continuously through Pakistan's history. Like, does political regime type, does political regime type, which is, democratic and dictatorship, specifically affects the economic performance and the achievements towards inclusive growth? And this is not just an economic question in Pakistan, it is a live political debate. Because arguments are, regularly made both in the elite circles and in the public discourse that Pakistan's economic performance has been better under the military governments than under the democratic civilian governments, and that the country might benefit from strong authoritarian leadership rather than the weak democratic governance. Now, this chapter examines these claims rigorously and empirically. Because an economist, our role is to subject all such claims, including, the ideological convenient ones, to evidence-based, arguments. And I want us to basically approach this analysis with open minds and rigorous methodology. Now, this discussion will touch on politically sensitive topics. I expect mature, evidence-based engagements from, economists and not, any kind of partisan advocacy. The goal is to give you analytical clarity and not, any political argument. So this is an economics works, not a political, political work. So um, the political regimes and growth. This chapter covers the theoretical literature on political regimes and economic performance, the construction of an inclusive growth index disaggregated by the political regime period, the empirical evidences on economic performance under different regimes in Pakistan, the concept of the welfare state, and how far Pakistan is from achieving it, and the policy implications are all what we are going to talk about today. So This chapter is original in constructing an empirical comparison of economic and social outcomes across Pakistan's different political regimes. The Ayub era, the Bhutto's era, the Zia era, the Benazir era, the Nawaz Sharif era, the Musharraf era, and the post 2008 democratic period, using some consistent data and methodology, and then we hold the comparisons. So the theoretical debate on regime type and growth has been ongoing, for decades, and there are three main positions in this literature. Yeah. So there are basically three main positions in this literature. First, importantly, is the authoritarian advantage hypothesis, which means that some scholars have argued that authoritarian governments, which are insulated from electoral pressures and the narrow interest groups, are better able to implement the long-term development policies to accumulate more investment for the country and achieve a higher growth. The East Asian development states, such as South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore particularly under the Lee Kuan Yew, are often cited as examples to it. Now, the second important position in the literature is the democratic advantage hypothesis, which says, that the other scholars argue that the democracies produce better long-term outcomes because they are more accountable to the population, which means that they're more likely to invest in human development, which wins vote, and better at avoiding some kind of catastrophic policy failures that authoritarian governments sometimes produce. The third is that the institutional hypothesis or the institutions hypothesis, which is a third position in the literature, and it strongly argues that the neither regime type per se determines outcome, and what matters is the quality of institutions. So some democracy have strong, effective institutions and achieve good outcomes, while others have weak, corrupt, and captured institutions and achieve poor outcomes. So the same is true for authoritarian states as well. Now, my view, which is developed in this chapter, is closest to the third position, which gives important insights specific to Pakistan's context. Now, what is your prior expectations about economic performance under democracy versus authoritarian in Pakistan? Let's count till 10, and I want you to have some, working going on in your brain and come up with an ideas that what do you think? Which has performed better, democracy or authoritarianism? One, two, three, four, five, six, seven, 8, 9, 10. I hope that you would have come up to some conclusion. It wasn't that easy, I'm sure. And until and unless you don't go into the empirical analysis, answering to this question as an economist is very tough. What evidence would you change your view? What evidence would change your view? Think about it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. The second question, which is like, what evidence would change your view, is more important one because it distinguishes, the analytical thinkers from the advocates. So let's now discuss the theory, the debate, and the index estimations. Before you move forward, you must know that what do we mean by, capabilities, entitlement, and inclusive growth. We have discussed very generously in the previous chapter that what do I mean by inclusive growth. If you want me to give you a quick overview, inclusive growth had many definitions, from OECD, from IMF, from World Bank. And I told you that the definition that I have, worked upon in my PhD thesis is that the inclusive growth is the growth for all. It is a kind of growth that, creates productive employment opportunities while taking care of people who are poor, and it also caters, to have more equitable distribution of resources among, different segments of society, irrespective of any differences. So this is the kind of, um, definition that I use for inclusive. Now, first, let's understand what do we mean by capabilities. Amartya Sen's book, he has written so many books, and he's one of my favorite author as well, especially, when Sen says development as freedom in his book, in which he talks about freedom. But anyhow, let's, just focus over here. So in Sen's idea, capability approach basically frames the inclusive growth in terms of expanding the human freedom. So, which means, the inclusive growth enhances the capabilities and entitlements. Now, capabilities are, health, education, and participation, whereas entitlements are access to resources, access to markets, access to institutions, and that is, the way forward for inclusive growth. So, inclusive growth would enhance the capabilities and entitlements for those groups which are the disadvantaged groups. The entitlement theory, which was developed by Sen, is basically in the context of feminine analysis, which argues that poverty and hunger result not from the food shortage, but from the failure in people's ability to actually, use their available resources. Uh, Let me get back to this slide. Yeah. So he is basically, yeah. So Sen is basically talking about, that what happens in poverty is not a result of something, because a food shortage has come, or because there is a flood, or there is some natural disaster. But argues that poverty and hunger basically origins from failures in the people's ability, from failures in the government's ability to command the resources through their endowments, through the production, trade, or state transfers. Now you can now transfer it towards, Pakistan, because, in Pakistan the capabilities entitlement framework suggests that inclusive growth requires not just economic opportunities that would enable the social conditions, but it will actually, for example, the girls must be educated to access those opportunities. The poor must have legal rights enforced. All of these things, are important part of a debate. So the welfare state concept is central to this chapter. A welfare state is a system in which the government plays a key role in ensuring the welfare of all citizens. Now, this could be through social insurance, this could be through redistributive taxation, this could be through universal public services. Now, this all basically is very important. So, this all is actually very important. So, a welfare state is a system in which, the government would play a key role, and it is going to take care of all citizens. Now, Pakistan has never achieved anything close to that welfare state. Public spendings on social services such as education, health, and social protection is among the lowest as a share of GDP of any country at Pakistan's income level. The state's primary activity have historically been defense, debt servicing, and patronage distribution through bureaucracy, rather than the broad based welfare provision. So, whether a welfare state is more achievable under democracy or authoritarian rule is one of this chapter's empirical question. Now, in principle, democracy should favor welfare state development because majority of voters are poor and they should elect governments that redistributes towards them. But in practice, democratic politics in Pakistan have been dominated by landed elites. and business interests who resist redistribution. So the index estimation methodology is used in this chapter, which adapts to the inclusive growth index from chapter 12 to the specific question of regime comparison. The technical details are in the chapter. The key methodological challenge is ensuring that comparisons are made fairly, controlling for all the other external factors, such as, the oil prices, the global growth, the natural disasters that can affect, the economic outcomes, independently of a regime type. So, the empirical findings basically do not support, the simple narratives of either democracy or authoritarianism being uniformly better. The Ayub era, which from 1958 to 1969, is often cited as Pakistan's golden economic age because that was the time when GDP growth averaged about 6% per annum. Industrial development was rapid in nature, green revolution was launched, and inequalities rose sharply. The 22 families' concentration of wealth became a national scandal, and East Pakistan's grievance was ignored. And political repression, ultimately led to the this you can say dismemberment of the country in 1971. An economic success story that ended in a national catastrophe is difficult to call an ambiguous success. The Bhutto's period. Now, the Bhutto's period, which is, from 1971 to 1977, had lower growth but made genuine attempts at redistribution and social development, which means, nationalization, land reform, education got a little bit expanded. The policy instruments were flawed and the execution were poor. But the intent was more generally redistributive than any previous government. Then came the Zia period, which was from 1977 to 1988, which benefited from, the massive inflows of US assistance and remittances from the Gulf. Exogenous factors that make economic performance comparisons, difficult. So the growth achieved was real, but built on a fragile remittance dependent foundation with a limited structural transformation. So the democratic period of the 1990s was economically turbulent in nature, partly due to genuine policy failures by both the Benazir Bhutto and Nawaz Sharif's government, and partly due to the legacy of Zia era debt accumulation and the economic cost of Pakistan's nuclear program. Now you talk about the Musharraf's period, which is 1999 to 2008 again, which benefited enormously from post 9/11 international financial support and debt relief. The growth achieved was real, which is, averaging over 6%, but again built on fragile external foundations. With the energy crisis, emerging at its end, the post 2008 democratic period has been characterized by genuine democratic consolidation. First, peaceful democratic transitions in 2013, second in 2018, and alongside, continuing the economic difficulties, energy crisis, and the macroeconomic stability. So, based upon this evidence, what conclusion would you draw about regime type and economic performance? I would push you to identify the co-founding factors that make simple regime comparisons misleading. The analytical lesson is about the research design and confounding, not just, about Pakistan. Okay. So another question that I want you to think upon is how far is the welfare state? To do so, let me get to the slide, which is an important question. The welfare state assessment. How far is Pakistan from achieving a genuine welfare state? Which is quite a sobering question. By virtually every indicator of welfare state development, Pakistan is very far from international norms. You talk about gender equality, you talk about social equalities, you talk about ethnic diversification, you talk about trade diversification. So there are so many, elements, so many, measures on which Pakistan is still lacking. We have a high population growth rate, the debt is surging, but hardly any composite fiscal or monetary policy is helping us out. So social spendings as a share of GDP is also among the lowest in the world for Pakistan. The social safety net, primarily, means the income support program or the SARS program, reaches only a fraction of those who actually need support. Labor rights in the formal sector are weakly enforced. In the informal sector as well, you see they are essentially non-existent. Universal health coverage remains a distant aspiration. Education quality and coverage are deeply inadequate. So, the welfare state is not just about spending, it is about the relationship between the state and the citizens. And in a genuine welfare state, citizens have right to basic services and protection, and the state is accountable for delivering them. In Pakistan, this right-based relationship between state and citizens is very weakly developed. Whether democracy or authoritarianism is more likely to lead Pakistan towards a welfare state model depends on how democratic politics evolve. If democracy is dominated by elite interests, it will not produce welfare state development any more than authoritarianism would do so. If democratic politics can be reformed to make government more genuinely accountable to the majority, through stronger political parties, through broader political participation, and reduced elite capture, then democracy holds more promise than authoritarianism for welfare state development. The normative case for democracy does not rest on short term economic performance. It rests on the values of human dignity and accountability and self determination, even if authoritarian governments sometimes produce high, short term growth. The human cost of authoritarian rule, suppression of, descendant, political imprisonment, denial of civil liberties are not outweighed by the economic gains. So this is a good chapter for a seminar style, discussion rather than a straight lecture, I believe. Consider assigning, different positions to your arguments. What are the advantages of democracy? What are the advantages of authoritarianism? Which comes first? Does institutions come first? And then I would ask you to then, make your synthesis, particularly make your synthesis in a panel, discuss with your friends and then come up to conclusion. Don't just, do your research alone, because when you sit with other people and of different fields, like someone from sociology, someone from political science, someone from Islamic studies, someone from economics, someone from business side, and then you're going to make a decision about which rule was a better one and which can, help Pakistan towards a welfare state. This will develop argumentation and critical thinking skills. With that, I would take a leave, and this ends your chapter 13 again of a very important book. See you till next time with another chapter. Thank you.